Hi, Jeremy. Thank you. It's a pleasure to follow on your vision. Culture and sport is truly something special, and a lot of that flows out of your life and your life story of trying to make our sports safer, better, and have the participants better knowledgeable about it. We have several discussants today, but what's going to follow is really a conversation, something that everybody can join into. We'll have time for questions. We'll have some flow back into this. So if you're listening passively, you can engage with us. We think this will be an excellent thing to do. I'm Bob Boland. For 5 years prior to the last year, I had one of the more interesting jobs in the world. I was the athletics integrity officer at Penn State, managing a consent decree between the NCAA and Big Ten and the university over its athletic program flowing out of the Sandusky scandal. Ever since that time, the crises seem to flow faster and faster, and we can figure out whether they flow in youth sports, whether they flow in the Olympics movement, whether they flow in the United States, or whether they flow in Canada. And today we're joined by a panel that has perspective on both sides of the border in both environment or all environments, and from a variety of perspectives who can talk about this. And since the only enemy of a conversation, particularly in the diffuse technical realm, is silence, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. I'll call on them, and let's let them give you a little bit about them, and then we'll come back and start to put some questions together. So, without regard to order, Nolan, would you kindly introduce yourself and share what you're doing here?
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, my name is Nolan Thiessen. I work for Curling Canada, the national sport organization for the sport of curling up here in the Great White North. And at one point, I was a competitive curler. I won 2 world championships and 3 Canadian titles. And and then I sort of moved into working in sports. I've got a CPA background. But I started working in sort of the business side of sports and trying to get connection through, all aspects of our sport, and really learning the sports business. And that's where I am at now with Curling Canada.
Nolan, we're excited to have you and welcome. Sonia Keating, you also come from the Olympic movement. Would you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Good morning. I'm Sonia Keating. I work with U.S. Equestrian, the NGB for equestrian sport here in the United States. We are based in Lexington, Kentucky. My background is legal. I'm a lawyer, and I've been the general counsel with U.S. Equestrian for almost 18 years now. So I've been intimately involved with their programs over the years as it relates to athlete abuse prevention.
Jeff Chatterton, you're also joining us from north of the border in Canada, where you specialize in a variety of PR disciplines, but most notably crisis communications and crisis recovery. And I think you and I share the prize of having met the farthest away from our homes. But Jeff, would you share a little bit about your background and what you're bringing to the panel today?
You're going to tease them. We met in Uganda, of all places. I have been doing pretty much nothing but crisis communications and what I call high stakes communications for the last 2 decades now. Have had the opportunity to work on a variety of projects, but more notably and more germane to this topic, I've been running around doing the crisis communications for a number of major sports venues, everything from the Staples Center, the Teleglobe, the O2 in London, everywhere from Shanghai to Sydney and places in between. So it's been a fun ride.
Thanks, Jeff. And you have done some crisis work with NGBs or sports organizations as well and institutions. So not unfamiliar
Absolutely.
with that. Yeah. Maddie Salomon, you're next up on the list, and you bring an interesting background. Would you share it with us?
Sure. So I'm an attorney and athlete advocate. I played lacrosse at Duke, then went down the road to UNC for law school. While I was in school, I chaired the Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee. So saw behind the scenes of the NCAA, saw that change usually happened from pressure from the outside, and have since been very active, pushing for NCAA reform, working with lawmakers, educating individuals who can affect change. I recently had the privilege of testifying before Congress for the 9th NIL hearing. And while I'm not overly optimistic that there's going to be forthcoming legislation on NIL, I kind of took the opportunity to talk about what I think is the most important issue in college sports, and that is the health and safety of athletes, especially those suffering abuse at the hands of their coaches and administrators.
Thank you so much, Maddie. And the last person on the panel who gets to work with me every day, my condolences and heartfelt sympathies. But before that, he was my student at Ohio University, Michael Chapman. So Michael, why don't you talk a little bit about your unique background and what you bring here today?
Thanks, Bob. It's not too bad working with you on a regular basis. I will say that. So my background, I'm an attorney. I spent 3 years though at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, or a little bit under, I guess. I was an original member of their compliance department, so helping put together the audits of national governing bodies once the Protecting Young Victims Act had gone through and Safe Sport had its authority. We obviously then had to put in place some compliance procedures. And actually, Sonia was a member of Equestrian when we did their first audit. So that's how I first met Sonia. I spent 3 years there, and since I left the center, I have now moved over with you, Bob, to the Shumaker, Loop, and Kendrick law firm, and we work externally helping NGBs and other individuals in sports in the athlete safety realm in any manner of ways that we can.
Thank you so much, panelists. This is our conversation. We can take it in a lot of directions, but I think we should probably do a little bit of educating on the front end of this. Right now, we're seeing a kind of a multiplicity of crises and scandals that name themselves, and I'll start with the one that I took over and tried to clean up at Penn State out of Sandusky. Baylor University and Title IX had its own challenges. Ohio State, Michigan, and Michigan State all had a crisis involving doctors and predation. USC, another issue with doctors and predation, also in its student center. The Michigan State one, of course, gets known by the Nasser crisis, the name of the perpetrator, but also spills over to USA Gymnastics into international sports. And then finally, we're really kind of picking up the pieces of a crisis in hazing at Northwestern. So if you think about it, we're really talking about a range of behaviors that range from youth protection, sexual misconduct, abuse, cultural abuse, hazing, coaching abuse, body shaming, physical and psychological abuse, and then ultimately coaching abuse, abusive coaching and misconduct as we move through this. All of us are somewhat experts in that realm, and we'll probably try to articulate some ways that we can make this better, the way we can get to a new legal standard in this way. But Nolan, as a guest in this one, and somebody we're really proud to have, curling caught a piece of this in Canada, and you've worked very hard to turn around what could be a negative story into a success story. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that came about and how you created a success story out of a negative one?
Yeah, so our crisis wasn't as much of, like a scandal or an abuse one. It was a high performance crisis. It was a crisis of expectations, so to speak, right? We had Canada in general, for those of us from Canada who are on the call, sometimes we have a bit of an inferiority complex to the American sports system. But I always laugh. I'm like, curling and hockey are two of the sports where we are the Yankees. We are expected to win all the time, every time out. And that's okay. Like, that's passion. And that's what I think a lot of us, why we work in sports, is because of the passion. It brings out something really neat in everybody. And, we weren't getting the results that we've had in the past and we expect of ourselves. And the public expects of us, and it ties so much to everything that we do in our business, and then how we fund the whole sports system, that it was super important. But I think the biggest thing that we did was we just one, acknowledge the problem. Like we aren't as successful as we used to be. And then we sat back and we went through a high performance review, and there was a lot of just active listening. We just said, say your piece, whatever you feel. And it's funny because there's a lot of talk that ended up coming out of it. And some of it at the end of the day didn't really get to the main focus of what a high performance program is. And at the end of it, we kind of got everybody on board because they got to say their piece about what they've always felt and some of the systems in place. And we said, can we properly define the problem? And the problem is we're not making enough curling shots. That's the problem. And then we've now been able to, we listened to everybody. It was almost as though there was barriers for everybody because they didn't feel like they had an avenue to speak. So we acknowledged the problem. They spoke to us, and then we said, okay, now this is do we all agree that this is the actual problem? Yes. Okay. So then now how do we fix it? How do we make more curling shots? That's how Canada is going to be more successful. And, we're starting to go down the path of, a bit of a new system and a bit of a new pathway with our high performance director and all of that stuff. So that's really what we did. We actively listened, and then we properly defined the problem.
That's a fascinating one, because Lee said in the first panel that we need to respond to complaints, that we need to be aware of them and have a mechanism for responding to complaints. And two, one of the things that I've written down about a new legal standard is that we have to have some fundamental level of transparency in what we do. And Maddie, I'm going to come to you on that one, because we've certainly had conversations in the past about that level of transparency, and at all stages to some degree. And it's a hard thing because a lot of sports goes on behind closed doors. We don't want to punish the people who are in it. But let's talk about those views, Maddie. I know you have some specific opinions in representing the needs of athletes. How can we do a better job both responding to complaints with some equanimity, and how do we have a better level of transparency?
I think a big part of the problem is there's no independent oversight. And unfortunately, behind closed doors, there are a lot of open secrets on most campuses, if not all, with very well-intentioned individuals wanting to help athletes. But when it comes down to addressing problems that may be taking place with coaches, athletes being abused, the inclination is to protect the institution over being transparent, over doing things that might actually help the athlete. It's about putting out fires, and there's no reporting structure up. The NCAA does not oversee coach behavior. It falls under the purview of the institutions, and that's all part of the problem. And we've seen, remarkably few examples, even though we've seen a many, but compared to the issues that actually go on around the country, and athletes I hear from, parents that I hear from, my own experiences, I think most people who have really seen behind the scenes of college sports understand that this issue is pretty massive, and addressing it is going to require some thought. It's going to require a shift in mindset, and it's going to require really a mindset that is taking preventative action, and realizing that that's actually going to benefit the institution as a whole. It's going to make programs more successful. It's going to make athletes more successful. It's going to make everybody feel safer, I think, in the environment, and that I think having an environment where you don't try to cover up issues, you want to create a positive culture. That's all part of the issue. I think there's an inclination to believe, the more successful a coach, the less you want to rock the boat and call out problematic behaviors. But we've seen how that does not work well. And in the long run, many athletes get, swept up in the process, and I think deal with these issues far beyond their playing days.
Maddie, I have to come back to you with a question, and this is an interesting one. Transparency certainly is a hallmark of this new legal standard we're driving for today. and maybe so's independent oversight. Can you tell me which one is a subset of the other? Is independent oversight a subset of transparency and confidence, or is transparency transparency achieved through independent oversight? The idea that we have that, and that's a goal in and of itself.
I guess I don't know how to answer. I think that having the independent oversight will facilitate a culture where people realize, okay, having someone look at what I'm doing is not that bad. So let's just be open about it. You can go back to team rules on many teams. One of the prevailing rules is keep it within the family in whatever form that takes on a team, with the mindset of, don't let anything out. And I think as coaches feel more comfortable sharing their own concerns and their own struggles and where they may not be connecting with athletes, and having someone check their behavior and just give them feedback, that all creates a culture where they then feel okay being more transparent, being more open, and you'll start to see sort of where the bad coaches really are weeded out in the process, and the ones that are trying to do it right, even though they may fall short sometimes, can be better.
That's
Can I say something?
Yeah, why don't you?
Oh,
Is this Laura?
hi. My name is Dr. Laura Mealy. I have twofold. I'm a sport and recreation forensic expert, but on my other favorite job is working with athletes and looking at coaching behaviors and athletic behaviors. And to piggyback on what Maddie is saying, hi Maddie.
Hi.
I find that coaches, if approached properly, in terms of their behavior, are very open to what you have to say to them. I think it's the way that we go about it. And I've been trying to do this. Pardon me, I'm out here in Pennsylvania, but I work with a lot of coaches in different states. And I've been trying to do as much as I can on this forefront, because I think it is so imperative that everyone understands that it's not just let's look at the way that the athletes are behaving. Let's look at the way the coaches are behaving. And sometimes the athletes are going to behave a certain way based on it. And then what kind of negativity can come out of it, which can be turn out to be something horrific. And so I just wanted to say that I'm glad that we're talking about this specifically, because I write about it. I write a Psychology Today blog, and I write about this kind of stuff very often. So thank you.
Laura, I think you're spot on in that, obviously, with my own experience. And I think Maddie obviously is so well frames the issue that a coach who knows that their culture is open will be better than those who think it will be closed. And that's a really key issue. I wanted to get into some of the external oversight operations, and that kind of comes to Sonia and Michael. We've heard a little bit about, and this is a US side operation. Canada will use the word safe sport a lot to talk about priorities, but we set up a government institution, and Sonia, that came from your work in some measure. Can you talk about kind of the origins of creating the US Center for Safe Sport, or the structure of it, and then the work you guys did as national governing bodies? And then Michael, let's talk a little bit about the Center for Safe Sport as we get to it. So 2 questions, kind of go for it.
Sure. So a little bit on the background. I think it was following the 2008 Olympic Games when particularly in swimming and the other NGBs were just fraught with claims of sexual misconduct and lawsuits. And then, quickly over a couple of years that followed, you saw, abuse across the sports, right? And there were some people, I was on one of the original NGB task forces that was looking at, okay, how do we help equip these national governing bodies with addressing this? So from a couple of different angles. One, ensuring that they have the resources to help train and educate the people and participants in their sport, and then also ensure that there is some harmonization across the sports as it relates to responding to allegations of abuse and resolving the allegations of abuse. So, I think quickly we were all in agreement that we really needed, particularly the sexual abuse required a pretty high level of specialization and skill sets, and having an independent entity to manage those across the movement would be beneficial, because this entity could could specialize in sexual misconduct and other forms of abuse and have, part of it dedicated to policy formation, education, training, and then the other on response and resolution, which ideally would end up with, similarly treated across the sports. And so out of that, the U.S. Center for Safe Sport was born. It launched in March of 2017, and within a year, Congress amended some of their statutes related to the Olympic movement and conduct involving children, and recognized the U.S. Center for Safe Sport and recognized that it would have the exclusive jurisdiction over sexual misconduct within the Olympic sport. So that's really how that launched. And I do think that there are some real benefits from that, because you've got the expertise. A lot of the sports organizations, that's just not how they have recruited and trained their staff. And you've got a lot of small NGBs that don't have the resources. So we can, rely upon the Center for Policy Development, ensure that there is harmonization across the movement with respect to policies, and then also with the response and resolution process as well.
Nolan, I want to just throw a quick question to you. In Canada, that is a mandate to each of the national sport organizations, though, right? It's not a singular body.
Correct. Yeah, it's all ran through sort of Sport Canada and then delivered down through the NSOs and then to our provincial territorial associations.
So a slightly different choice of approach, but again, an approach trying to reach the same level in every case. Michael, you were one of the first in at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, and your job was auditing the national governing bodies on their compliance. Can you talk about your safe sport experience and some judgments on the center, its efficacy, and the process?
Yeah, we could probably do a whole nother panel just about that. But in terms of my time there, I think I was one of the first 30 employees at the center. The center had really started to expand when I had joined. Funding was kind of getting in line, and we were finding a way to, not that funding is ever sufficient there. I think that is one thing, if you ask the center, that more funding would always be better in an area like this. But when I was there, I think one of the things I saw was, to what Sonia said, was it's amazing the gap and the disparity sometimes between your larger NGBs with resources and those smaller ones that the center effectively ended up serving kind of as an advisor for them of, here's how we can write this policy, here's how we can put this in place, here are the things that we can do, because the center then is providing their expertise. We were using our information, what we knew at the time, from a lot of different people who had done research and were writing training manuals, to the people on the response and resolution side, to those of us that had just worked in sports and compliance, all together, helping all these NGBs. And I think the disparity there is one of the biggest things that always hit me, was it always felt like there could have been more resources available or dedicated to the smaller ones and helping them, because they were going to struggle more. And in terms of the efficacy, I think we've seen a massive growth in the efficacy of the center since it was first created and first started, but that doesn't mean the work is there. I don't think you're anywhere near the peak of what the center can be and really what it should be. And I think that's going to have to continue to grow and move forward as we move forward in sports altogether, but specifically in the Olympic movement. I think the resource question is perhaps one of the biggest ones that's left to answer, of how do we make sure there's enough resources to protect athletes, because this isn't a money-making endeavor, but it is a money-saving endeavor if you do it right. And how do we focus that to make sure that what money we have available and what resources we do have available are being used properly, or as much as they can be in this area? Because I don't think, just in general in sports, we put enough resources to it. And I think it's something that the center can really help highlight. Like, imagine if they had double the resources they had now, how much better could they be? And the answer is infinitely better than they are now. And that's not saying they're doing bad, but more resources makes it easier. And I think you'd find that across the board in athlete safety.
Michael, you queued up the question I was going to take next, and I'll quote Bruce Hornsby, who wrote the song, even though Don Henley is more famous for singing it. Lawyers dwell on small details. And those of us who are lawyers sometimes think of crises only in the in the harm or the cost. And I kind of run down, ticking down them, that Nasser is probably $1 billion crisis pretty easily. That Sandusky was a $370 million crisis. Baylor probably about 600 million, and they're running in at about 600 million to $1 billion now in crisis range when they get to be bad. And we have no idea where Northwestern is going to go at which point. So, but if we only think about them in terms of money, we're missing more than the iceberg. We're missing all of the human toll in this, and we've done a panel on that in the past. And Jeff, you're really good at summing things up. Let me come to you. We've talked about this. We know it's a problem. We know we need to tackle it. What's the cost, and why does it matter?
I mean, the cost, I mean, you nailed the cost in terms of dollars and cents. I mean, the business of sport is literally billions of dollars. I like to tell my sport clients, you know, whether it's a major arena or a national sport organization or anything else, it's really, it's fragile money. It's not a guaranteed thing, and that is why reputation and the perception of risk just becomes so much more apparent. At the end of the day, it's a harsh reality, and I don't want to be rude to anyone, but sports is there to entertain us. Sports is a diversion. Sports is what we do at 7 o'clock at night, you know, in order to not have to think about our bills or what we're doing in order to get the garbage out. I mean, that is, you know, that's what it gives us something to talk about to our buddies at work and at the bar, but it's a diversion. When sport starts to introduce the very things that we are diverting from, it all falls apart. That is, you've seen it with abusive coaches. People say, "Hey, look, I want, you know, I want my fun. I want to be able to watch the touchdowns. I want to be able to see the goals, but I don't want to see it at a particular cost." It's especially apparent at the NCAA level, where people are starting to say, you know what, it's not the job of an NCAA coach to get wins. It's the job of an NCAA coach to create fantastic young adults using sport. And you know what, maybe it's not so important that they put their life or their health at risk just to, you know, get their names in a record book somewhere. And when they touch that rail, when they hold on to that mental consciousness and remind people that this is a diversion and that there are real issues out there and they're not doing them well, everything comes apart very loudly, very quickly, and it's ugly.
Yeah, I think you're so spot on in that sport is one of the few relationships where we use power and identity and immediacy so strongly. There's always another game, always another competition, something else to be ready for. And when the cost is maximized, is made worse because we didn't deal with it, it becomes a really big issue. I want to go with a couple of quotes to the panel, throw it out to each of them. And they're just sort of aphorisms, but I wanted to have you react to it. Lou Holtz famously said there are only two kinds of coaches: those who've been fired and them that's going to be. I've actually amended that to describe it as there are only two kinds of coaches: them that's been investigated and them that's going to be. And also the other one is the cover up is always worse than the crime. So I want to put it out to the panel and sort of say, do you want to respond to either of those? Or you can just say, hey, Bob, you're really a terrible moderator. You need to get a new job, which I know nobody's going to do because you're all going to be polite and entertain those questions. But let's talk about the investigations and let's talk about the cover-ups a bit. How do we manage in our world today?
I'm going to jump in and and talk about the one issue that I think is a little bit in my wheelhouse, which is the cover up versus the crime. And I'm not going to name names or details, but I'm familiar with and have been involved with coaching investigations where players accused a coach of having said things that were probably inappropriate. The so many times I cannot tell you how many times I could sit there and put my arm around a coach and go, dude, just come out and say, yeah, you know what? I said some things I probably shouldn't have. It was a heated moment. I'm human. I apologized as soon as I realized what I had done. I'm going to make steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. The problem goes away. No one really cares. The public is remarkably able to forgive you if you give them the tools to forgive you. It's the, well, that never happened, and then the, how dare you say that, and then, you know, the following day, you know, cell phone video arrives and you're just prolonging the story, and before you know it, you're unemployed and sending your resume out trying to become the next women's volleyball coach at a second tier university.
We won't comment about any of those sports or specific examples, but I'm smiling because, yeah, the humility of asking forgiveness and saying, boy, did I mess that one up, is probably something that's wildly overlooked in our field. How about the idea about investigations? How prevalent do we see it? How is the body politic in dealing with this investigations world that we live in? At the NGB level and the college level, how are we dealing with it? Are we communicating it well? Are we doing a poor job with it? Are we doing a good job with it?
I think at least oftentimes in the collegiate world, many of the investigations are unsatisfactory. I think partly it's the lack of transparency, partly it's, you know, athletes have come forward with complaints, and at the same time, former athletes who are very loyal to a coach or people who sing the praises of the coach will come forth, and ultimately a school will decide to reinstate a coach who has shown and proven to be abusive, because some people don't think so. And I think that that's with so many of these things, especially in the verbal abuse realm, it's not always extremely clear. It's very subjective. It's very personal. But when you sort of paint the picture and see story after story that follows a similar trend, that has similar themes of how a coach sort of abuses a team or otherwise creates a very, very toxic culture and the impact on athletes. I think we see it a lot in female sports, unfortunately. I think that the abuse that goes on between men's and women's sports tends to take similar trajectories. I think you tend to see sort of overt behavior on the part of men's coaches, some of it physical. When it comes to women, it's very mental and emotional. It's behind closed doors. It's a lot of it's implied things. It's things that are said. It's how teammates are pitted against each other. And when teammates come forward in the event that a large sampling of athletes at the same school on the same team come forward, it's individual stories. It's how a coach individually targeted athletes. And then it goes back to sort of what we were talking about before. Some of these coaches are very vindictive. They do it on purpose. Other coaches, I think, really think that they're either motivating their players, it's the way they were coached, they think it's the way that things should be done, and they don't really fully understand the impact on the athletes. They don't realize that years after these athletes have graduated, they still don't want to talk about their experiences in college. I have teammates like that, I have friends like that. And it's amazing when you get a bunch of athletes together who kind of communicate about their very similar stories. They realize if they could go back, they see it very clearly. They either see insecurities sometimes on the part of coaches. They see where these coaches were just misguided, but it doesn't really take away that impact. And I think that if we could really get to the root of the problem, which is teaching coaches how to coach, in many cases that would solve a lot of the issues beyond the transparency.
Nolan, you began our session talking a little bit about taking responsibility, the idea that you responded to things neutrally and that you took responsibility. Jeff, you may want to jump in on this with what you just said. How do we begin a culture of responsibility and understanding in a neutral way, not a protective way? How did that change the building and the sport when you did it?
Yeah, like, I mean, even to Maddie's point, it's almost like coaching and the way sports was done in the past was like there's a one size fits all, or this is how I do things, and there was no actual attention to what does this person need, what does this athlete need, what does this athlete need. And it's a harder thing now, and it just in general with all of this stuff, it's not just this is how we do things. It is more of how should we do things, how do we coach people, how do we lead in a way that creates a mutual and universal benefit or universal growth for the whole organization or the whole sport. But there's a bunch of different avenues to get there, as opposed to just saying this is how I do it and I'm the leader, so therefore you have to follow me. I think it's that acknowledgement that everybody's different, and outlining the goals of safe, healthy sport is a goal that everybody wants, right? People want someone to be a part of a sport and feel safe, and for our in our world, as I was talking about, define the problem of what is our high performance goal. It's to win curling games, and I think properly defining that, those are universal goals that people will all agree to, but then we may have to all get there in different ways, and that's okay.
Sonia, I was just running some numbers. You have between 200 and 300,000 members at US Equestrian, which is around the population of Lexington, Kentucky, which is a fair-sized city, right? I mean, you have a lot of members who have a lot of different viewpoints and different touch points with the sport. How have you gone about implementing practices that produce safeguards and producing outcomes that are positive? And what are some of the challenges in doing that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, there's a lot of challenges. For one, our sport has never been highly regulated, and it's not club-based. It's for the most part an individual sport, and most of the members will seek out a trainer or coach that is in the geographic area where they live, who has held themselves out as an expert in equestrian. And we've never had, as an NGB, we've never had a formalized coach certification program or trainer certification program. So one of the challenges for us in this sport is that these are just individual businesses that are out there that we don't have any control over. Again, we don't certify them, we don't bless them, we don't otherwise recognize them as businesses. But in 2018, we did go out and issue a requirement whereby anyone who was a senior active member who was 18 years old and over was required to do the safe sport training. That was met with a lot of backlash, because that did cover some of our adult amateur members who said, look, I'm an amateur, I don't train kids, why do I need the safe sport training? So it's taken a while for us to educate the constituents that it really does take the community. I mean, this is a community effort. Under the federal law, there's now it's a crime not to report any kind of suspected sexual misconduct, and there is no statute of limitations on that. So they need to be aware of what their legal obligations are. And it's important that everybody know how to recognize and respond to any signs of abuse. I mean, I got a email today with a Instagram screenshot informing me that this person was at a horse show over the weekend. Well, I don't know who this person is, but apparently it's someone who's on the suspended list. And under the equestrian rules, if you are banned or suspended, then you're not permitted on the grounds at all. It's not that you're not permitted to participate. You're not allowed to be at the venue on the horse show grounds. But many of these venues are large, right? I mean, you've got stabling areas, you've got, depending on the breed or discipline, you've got acres to cover. So that's another challenge as well, is on the enforcement end. And we really do depend upon our, community to help enforce any sanctions that are imposed.
Yeah, it's a big one, and reporting becomes a problem too, because everybody reports a little differently. I was going to pivot right to Michael, knowing that he does this work and this is part of the work that we do. Could you give some advice on how to report more effectively and effectively? And then anybody else could jump in on this. But Michael, you deal with reports that come in from complainants, and they come in like they did from, as Sonia said, they sent you a picture of a person and told me do something about this.
Mhm.
How can we do a better job, or how can the community do a better job in making reports that are able to be investigated and managed?
I think it comes down to just the specificity that you put into a report. Anytime you're sending a report, it's not as simple as, oh, hey, here's the picture, this person's violating a rule. Like, the more you know, the more we know, the easier it is for us to jump into it. What rule do you think is being violated? Is it somebody that was on the suspended list? Do you have a name? Do you have an event that they were at? When did this occur? How is all of this happening? And I think it is, to a degree, on those of us who advise organizations like national governing bodies, but also on the national governing body themselves. And I think this is where the center has helped, of designing reporting platforms that ask enough questions to get to specificity, so that people are giving you the information you need, at least for a jumping off point. I think that's the thing too, is you don't have to know. We have to find that balance, right, between report anything that you think is a violation, make sure we know, because we can't investigate if we don't know, but also at the same time, if you don't give us enough, we still can't investigate. But we don't want you to fail to report because you're not sure about exactly what rule is violated, but we do want you to give us enough information. I think it's a balancing act. I think policy can help. If you're writing a really good policy, Bob, you and I just spent some time doing this the last week and a half, of how do we find that balance between what we're asking for in terms of information and what, if somebody can be, anonymous in reporting and do things like that. Yeah, that's the case, but then let's also give you some guidance and some cautionary words on what that equates to. I think at the end of the day, the big key is, as Sonia said, education. The more people know, and the more you can kind of walk them through the process, whether it's your policies themselves or the way they report, that's going to be the best way to do it. And that'll give them the platform to give you enough information to give you the jumping off point for any investigation.
And there is a bit of a walk in this process, isn't there, Michael, that when somebody makes the national governing body or the sport organization or the university aware, they have to at least be willing to go a bit further in that process, don't they?
Absolutely. You have to, if you get a report, you can't just dismiss it because you don't think there's enough evidence or enough info in the report itself. You have to do, at least the center would call it preliminary inquiry, and I think it's a great way to term it, which is you've got to at least do some questioning about any report you receive before you can dismiss it and say there isn't enough here for us to proceed. If you have a couple of interviews and you're still going, there's not enough here, then maybe you've done enough. But if you don't even do a couple of interviews, I think that's where you leave yourself open to being the next one with a big scandal going of, well, this was reported, the report wasn't great, but it was reported and you didn't do anything. That's not going to look good at the end of the day if that's the way you handle it.
Sonia, you've been nodding to this one. Let's get you in on this one too.
Well, earlier you asked about investigations. I thought I agreed with everything that Maddie said, and that was some great discussion, but one challenge we have is because we do accept anonymous reports. We've tried to remove every barrier possible to reporting, including the rollout of an anonymous texting platform that is managed by a third party. And, sometimes you don't get enough information, or you'll get a third party that will report. And as you start digging into it and you contact the actual, what I'll refer to as a claimant, the person impacted. And I've got one right now, and they do not want to be involved. They do not want to be involved at all. It's not, of course, it's not sexual misconduct because we don't investigate those. This is more emotional and bullying. And the athlete is 18, but athlete and athlete's parent are like, no, we don't want anything to do with this. So I've got a third party reporter who just observed some behaviors, who is insisting on knowing all the details. And that's the other piece that's difficult, is as a third party reporter, you're not really entitled to know everything, right? But it does limit what you can do, because at the end of the day, under the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act, we have to afford someone a hearing before we can take away their right to participate in sport. And that includes coaches and trainers and athletes. We see a lot of peer-to-peer misconduct. And so in doing so, there are certain, if I take a disciplinary matter to the hearing committee, I've got a burden of proof that I have to meet. These aren't our employees. These are just dues paying members and participants in the sport. So it is really challenging, because we do hear a lot about, well, I reported that and nothing was done. And we can't always tell the rest of the story as to maybe why disciplinary action wasn't taken, or maybe there was some measures taken that aren't published out to the membership. So it's a challenge, and it's a frustration for a lot of people, and particularly ones that don't really understand how the process works.
It is absolutely, as you say, Maddie. I wanted to come to you for a second, only because you might be walking the same walk with someone on the other side of this, helping a victim, helping to advocate for somebody who feels wronged. And I hate to say this, but there were certainly complaints that came into me that focused were pretty easy to dismiss, in the way that they were focused on, I don't get played enough, or I don't get, my child doesn't get enough playing time, and therefore the coach is abusive. Conclusory ones like that, and certainly there are some out there. I don't want to make light of it, because we do need to look into everything. We needed to go the whole way. But if you were talking to an athlete and giving them advice, how would you sift through their claims, and how would you advise them to move forward, being on their side?
I usually start with what their goal is, because I think the unfortunate part, especially in college sports, is there tends to be a lack of a sense of justice, because sometimes taking action will put an athlete in a worse position. So one of the things that I actually have a conversation about is, before I get involved as a lawyer, let's talk through really what your goal is. Is your goal to stay? Is your goal to leave? Are you wanting to take action? Because the second that I reach out to the school, everything shuts down. And so trying to figure out if there are better channels first for the athlete to talk to the coach, for the parents to talk to the administration. Are there other teammates that are willing to step forward? Is this a systemic issue? Is this really personalized to your child or to you? What really is going on, and what is the outcome that you're looking for? And sometimes my advice is that doing nothing might put you in the better position. It depends where an athlete is in scholastically. Are they a freshman? Are they a senior? Do they think that they have options somewhere else if that becomes a problem? And what is potentially being alleged by the coach? Is there some disciplinary action? Did the athlete do something? Those are the cases that I think get tricky, because if the coach is saying, an athlete was disrespectful, they did something, their behavior is a problem, that creates an issue. If it's many teammates kind of experiencing the same thing, it's an overall toxic culture, that becomes something where you can maybe band together more athletes. But again, it's all case specific, it's all very complicated, and it's all, what are you willing to do? Are you willing to stick your neck out? I as a former athlete would never ask another athlete to stick their neck out in that way, if that's not something they're willing to do. Certainly it can prevent, future issues, but I've seen too many times where many athletes on a team will come forward to their administration and report the same things and nothing is done. And I have to prepare them for that outcome, potentially. So it's a lot of that.
And sometimes even if something's done, they won't tell you that it was done to their detriment.
Right.
I'm fascinated by this conversation, but I'm also looking at the names of the people who are in this session. And my God, we could easily trade places with you, and you might have a better session given the talents and skills that you've had out in the world. So I want to open this up for about 15 to 20 minutes of questions with our panel. I wanted to go through just one little thing before I do that, and maybe we can test that a little bit in the questions, but please feel free to do it. I think the best way for me to acknowledge you with a question is if you put your hand up, I'll get to you and get your question in. That way I can unmute you, I think, as the host is the best way probably to do that. But we'd love to have you ask some questions of our panel. But looks like we've gotten to a new standard, a new legal standard in protecting athletes and what we're doing. I think our panel has really given us about 6 bullets that we need to train and educate, that the training and education probably needs to be neutral, that we need a transparent process, that it probably has the idea of independent, equanimitable, yoga word that I like to use because I'm such a yogi. Not really, but I try. And that we need to have a response for everybody. We also have to have some knowledgeable expertise. And I see, as I look at the Northwestern case, particularly illuminating to me, that, but Nasser, Penn State in the same way, we're not going to be just charged for what we know now. We're going to be charged for what we should have known in the past. And to some degree, that's an important piece. So we need to have knowledge, whether it's survey data, whether that we're continuing to stay in contact with our athletes and talking to them about the challenges, whether we're surveying them in the future after their careers are done or after they leave, and we have an anonymous third-party reporting tool that we could use, as Sonia pointed out, all really, really good ideas. So you can put things in the chat. You can also raise your hand. So I'm opening this up to the floor. I hope this will be an interesting conversation. I'll start to scale around and look for hands up, but please, love to have you ask some questions.
Just an idle observation, Bob. I responding to your, we're not going to be charged based on what happened, but based on what we ought to have known. I think, especially at the collegiate level, at the NCAA level, at the NSO level, and I'm hearing the challenges that people like Sonia have in terms of balancing all of these competing priorities. The big one that needs to be addressed is when did you know? Because if you have a process that takes 6 months and that coach continues to conduct the same behavior, you're now as guilty, and in the eyes of the public anyway, at allowing that behavior to fester and to continue. And so where do we draw the balance between speedy justice and actual justice and making that public?
That's a tremendous question. Michael, you just did something like that in a rulemaking panel. What was the standard? Did the standard come out of that?
I don't know that there's a standard for that. I'm sure Sonia has dealt with this, and anybody who has worked in this area has dealt with it. Temporary measures are a very big and important item because there's always there's a balancing act with any sanction, but especially temporary measures. There's a really big balancing act between protecting athletes of risk that may or may not exist and not overstepping and taking someone out of a sport that maybe should still have the right to participate in. And how do we find that balance? I think one of the things we're seeing is that there may be an effort to find more middle ground in temporary measures, i.e. things like you have to have a chaperone to a degree. So if you're going to participate in a sport as a coach, there has to be another adult. That person has to be present at all times if you're meeting with an athlete or coaching or whatever. And it limits your capabilities, but it doesn't take you away from the sport. And so now we've got a balance between the two. It might not be perfect, but to Jeff's point, we don't allow them to coach unfettered, but we also don't take away their right to participate, which is the counterbalance to the idea of allowing them to participate if they're abusive in some way. So if anybody else finds the answer to that, please share it with me, because I don't think there's one perfect answer, but I do think there are steps and actions you can take to find the best one in any given scenario.
Jeremy Piasecki just texted me a question on that one, and I don't know if it's for me or not, but we'll throw it to the panel. Isn't everyone innocent until proven guilty, and shouldn't they be able to coach until they're proven guilty? And my answer to that one would be, well, no. Some conduct and allegation are so severe we can't allow you to move forward for the safety of the community. And I think that's where you turn on the interim measure ultimately. Anybody else want to jump on that and say that there's some things that we need to act on allegation?
I also think how believable is whoever's bringing forward something. If you're relatively certain that something bad took place, I think it's safe to say you can remove the coach from their coaching duties. Obviously, there's a lot of gray in there, but I think there are definitely circumstances where you would definitely take a coach out of coaching.
Sure. And this is a problem that flows into the professional sports too. I mean, we can't look at recent history without seeing the challenges of my favorite baseball team, the New York Mets, the challenges of Robert Sarver and basically losing his team in Phoenix with the Suns, Daniel Snyder, toxic environments and hostile environments and sexist environments are going to exist in every place and are going to come with massive consequence. Now, Daniel Snyder got about $5 billion in profit, so not such a horrible outcome in that, but he was essentially thrown out of the NFL with some people chasing him. So an interesting one to think about, that there's really no environment safe from this. Again, I'm going to say that you're an extraordinary group of audience. Let's get some questions in from you. And I have a raised hand from Fiona. Fiona, I'm going to try to unmute you. If you're unmuted already, go ahead. Go ahead. You're good.
I can do it. I just wanted to add to what you were saying. You may or may not have heard of me through, because I kind of work a little bit on the stealth measure, but I work directly with athletes that have been accused of things. So it's not just the coaches, but a lot of professional athletes under investigation. And it's always interesting the way that we kind of have come from the assumption that every athlete will be accused or will come into contact with some sort of a crisis situation. So what can you do to kind of make it so that you're resilient and you can withstand that? And one of those things is I know that earlier Jeff talked about not having this collision of say politics and, but one of the things that we do is make sure that people judge you or have a perception about you based on your reaction to things, right? So not just what you do, but how you react. So we actually sometimes use those points of view to have athletes put things out there so people know who you are. If all you're showing them is your jersey, so your game day stuff, and then your fake or real charity situations, they don't really know. So one of the things that we do to kind of help prevent and protect athletes when they are accused of things is try to put out the real them of who they are, so that when they do have to do that apology, like Jeff said, if you just apologize, that would be great. We actually know whether it's a stock answer or a boilerplate, which I don't agree with, or whether it's actually a real emotional response to something. And that can only be achieved if prior to that, you've really put out who that athlete is. So something to consider is, again, with coaches as well. I don't like to call it branding. We just basically put it out there as building a resilient sort of brand, I guess, but understanding that everybody is measured by perception, not by actual facts. So I've had those calls from the commissioners. I've had them ask me stuff and speak on behalf of athletes, and athletes that no longer play in their pro sports that I've worked with. And some of them were guilty, some of them weren't, to be honest. So yeah,
or
not all innocent until proven guilty, for sure.
or as a lawyer, in some cases, as we all know, we're not guilty of everything that they say that we're guilty of. In some cases,
Yeah, well,
justice is in the middle.
It's
Yeah,
interesting.
one
There's a
thing.
flip side there, right? There's branding to the extent that you create a brand that people don't believe you could have done anything. When
Exactly.
you're talking, I mean, one of the outside of sports, the YouTube mom who had a channel talking about how to raise kids. I think there were some red flags that were apparently raised throughout, but you know, it's possible to like somebody so much that you don't think that they could have done the things that they're accused of. So there's definitely a balance.
Yeah, and
it's interesting.
One of the things that we do is I sit down with every athlete for 2 hours. I have a 120 questionnaire, and I find out usually within 7 to 10 minutes. I don't know if it's the Aussie accent working in North America, but I find out where the bodies are buried pretty early. If somebody tells me that there was some sort of a sexual assault thing when they were teenagers, let's say, we don't let them attend a Me Too gala. That's just running a little close to the sun. So that woman should never have done that kind of YouTube. would be my thing. But yeah, for sure.
A question that came in from Joe. Thank you, Joe. We'll just answer that the same thing has happened in all other organizations. Obviously, sexual abuse, youth protection issues are rooted throughout those organizations. And he made the comment that it's happened with the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts of America are in receivership right now and going through a process of trying to pay their victims and compensate their victims through a variety of state litigation. Laura, you asked a terrific question in the chat, and I want to go to you because it's one of the fundamentally difficult issues of somebody who investigates stuff. How do you respond when something wasn't caught the first time, or maybe even was looked into but wasn't able to be adjudicated effectively? Do you want to add some color to that and ask that again? I'll leave that to the panel. Go ahead, folks. What do you do in a second and third shot? How do you deal with it? I always found sometimes there were investigations where I took 3 or 4 times to get to the outcome that people sought the first time, or find out something that was dispositive. How do you deal with it when you don't find it the first time but find it later?
I think the difficulty is going to be in the balancing between, you already have some information, you did an investigation, so you gathered some facts, but if you now have a new claim, how much of the old investigation are you going to use, and how will it influence your pursuit of this new investigation? So do you go back to some of them to see, are we now seeing a pattern? Because I think that is one thing that you can see. It almost brings up the idea of there's a pattern of behavior, and the pattern, the center in a lot of their things like bullying and harassment, there has to be a pattern of behavior for it to be considered bullying, because it's not like one-off comment is not bullying, because it's just a one-off comment in the eyes of the center, the way they write their policies. But now if we're putting a pattern of behavior together, to me, the type of remark that crosses the line gets lower and lower in terms of the bar, because if you're doing it all the time, it doesn't have to be as egregious, because it can be the constant of the lower level. And so I think you've got a balance between going back, using the information, seeing if you're creating a pattern, but also not relying too much on past investigations to dictate the current investigation that you're dealing with.
Let me twist the hypo just a little bit here. What happens if it was something that was reported but not investigated? I'll give the classic scenario. A report came in, put us on notice, but it wasn't investigable. What the report about didn't give us any insight to allow us to investigate. No complainant came forward. Maybe something was missing. How would that change our process? How might we respond to that when we later got more information?
I'll say you better have a key message ready to go that explains exactly why you didn't investigate, and it better be something that is publicly accessible, digestible, and understandable. Otherwise, you're dead in the water. It doesn't matter what you're investigating. You had a job to do and you failed to do it.
That's a great point, Jeff. we've got a few more minutes, so we've got about 5 minutes for questions, and I know we have about as an august audience as we possibly could have. So if there's a chance you want to ask something, you can ask it in the chat. You can raise your hand and kind of unmute. We'd love to hear from you.
So to piggyback again on this investigations, just a brief scenario situation where an athlete was having an issue with the coach, star player, so it wasn't a playing issue. And I got to observe all of the behaviors. I didn't find anything that was something that I should report at the time. Then after the season, when I really wasn't around, the coach kept sending text messages to this kid, being very hostile. The kid was starting to get very stressed out. I contacted the parents. The parents by that time already had, called the president of the school. And then there was a hearing because the kids just decided I can't stay at the school anymore. I went to the State Department and complained, and they did nothing about it.
That is a difficult scenario. Anybody in the panel want to jump on that one?
Do we know?
Go ahead.
Again, I think this comes back to the whole question of transparency versus privacy that Angela's bringing up right now. Do we know that they didn't do anything about it, or did they just not report and explain publicly what they're doing about it? Because again, those are two very different things. And where does one draw the line?
Well, I think there has to be some type of documentation to demonstrate that there was some type of investigation that they did not have.
And I have to apologize because I've just gotten the sign that I need to end the session. We are over time. I want to thank the panelists tremendously. You guys are wonderful. We'll be available later in the meeting room, and we want to thank all of you who sat in on this session. I can't thank you enough, and remind you that our law firm that sponsored this is Shumaker, Loop & Kendrick. We do investigative work in this space. We are anxious to help and work with you on a variety of processes and would like to be your trusted advisor. Thank you again, and thank you to our panelists.